On BBC1 now, David Attenborough explores the world's grasslands in part 5 of his portrait of the Earth, the living planet. This series, together with the accompanying book, will be reviewed.
But his interest in this chilling drama and his transformation into the desperate and potentially dangerous scientist John Loomis. A transformation which has been captured on the front cover of the new Radio Times.
Thursday evening on BBC1 continues now with part 6 of David Attenborough's portrait of the Earth in The Living Planet.
Folds in the Caravaggio conspiracy and on the cover of the new Radio Times.
Now on BBC1, we follow David Attenborough up and away into the sky above in this week's episode of The Living Planet. In next week's programme about water, David Attenborough embarks on a 4,000-mile journey down the River Amazon. The Living Planet, next Thursday at 8:05. And you may be interested to know that the third and final part of the quiz linked to the Living Planet series can be found in the March edition of the magazine BBC Wildlife, with the South American monkey on the cover, available from newsagents. On BBC2 shortly, those dear ladies, Dr. Evadne Hinge and Dame Hilda Brackett, decide to liven up the atmosphere in Stackton Trestle by opening a radio station. Here on BBC1 in 25 minutes, part 8 of Diana by R.F. Deltafield. That's at 9:25 and follows the 9 o'clock news now with John Humphreys.
Unions concede the government's got its way over Cheltenham, and the handful who've defied the ban. Soccer hooligans a disgrace to Britain, says Mrs. Thatcher. The FA warns we could be banned abroad. Lebanon, now the French to pull out as well. Remarrying in church, another step to help divorced people. And a royal premiere for racing's champion. Good evening. The government has won its fight to get rid of unions at the Cheltenham Communications Centre. The civil service unions have conceded that the vast majority of staff have now signed the government's form, either agreeing to leave their union or accepting a transfer from Cheltenham. But they say they'll fight to restore the unions. They're trying to set up a new society of GCHQ staff, and they say they'll stand by anyone sacked for refusing to sign the government's form. Bill McCall of the Civil Service Union said Cheltenham workers had been subjected to intensive and disgusting pressure by the government. At Westminster, Mrs. Thatcher thanked the majority who'd signed the form. They were now well in excess of 90%, she said. Tonight in Cheltenham, fewer than 100 workers who refuse to leave their union or GCHQ are meeting to plan their next move. Neil Bennett is there.
These are the few GCHQ staff still defying the government. Many have signed what the unions call Option C, which declares that they don't want to leave either their unions or GCHQ. National officials were at a hotel in Cheltenham tonight to promise them continuing support. Only time will tell how the management are going to deal with the people who've signed Option C. For those who have, the campaign has now reached a new and potentially much more difficult phase. Earlier in the day, union official Nancy Dufton was told she'd have to clear her office at GCHQ after 2 years on full-time union business. But she insists that the unions at Cheltenham aren't finished.
As far as we're concerned, there are still people inside this base who want to be trade union members. And so long as those people are there, we are going to be there to represent them.
How are you going to be able to do that from now on?
We have already set into motion some sort of contingency plan. We'll have an office in the town. We will be setting up this office as an advice centre. We will be keeping in touch with our members inside the base as well.
As far as you're concerned, is it now all over or not?
Not at all. It's only just beginning as far as I'm concerned.
The officer who'll be maintaining the union presence in the town has now arrived at Cheltenham. He has no idea how long he'll be required or indeed be able to offer his services.
The unions have waged a skillful and determined campaign over GCHQ, but it wasn't enough to force the government to back down. Their only hope was to persuade 10% of the Spy Centre's workforce, that's about 700 people, to refuse the government's terms. Sir Brian Tovey, the former GCHQ director, admitted this would threaten the whole operation, but it was not to be.
It's now pretty obvious that the government have forced sufficient people to sign their option to enable them to continue the GCHQ operations. That's sad. We acknowledge it to be sad. We don't criticize our members at all. They have been subjected to intensive and disgusting pressure.
It could take months before staff staying in unions leave GCHQ, and the government, having been accused of inflexibility, now seems to be treading carefully.
It's clear now that the vast majority have accepted, and now obviously it will be necessary to try and handle the other problems, and people who have strong views of principle, to handle those as sympathetically and as understandingly as it's possible to do, because a decision having been taken, and that having been supported by the vast majority of the people there, that's obviously what's now got to happen. That's the way it's going to go on. But certainly I shall be very anxious to see, as far as it comes within my powers, to see that this is handled in a sympathetic and sensible manner.
There could yet be problems. Some people will never give up their unions, but the government's obviously anxious not to create any union martyrs. So Mrs. Thatcher's got her way. The unions say she always held the best cards and that hers is a hollow victory.
English football hooligans have been condemned by Mrs. Thatcher. After the violence at last night's match in Paris, she said the small minority of fans were a disgrace to their country, and she called for strenuous efforts to stop it happening again. In Paris, Madame Avis, the French sports minister, said the violence distorted sport's spirit of friendship between people. And as the clean-up began, a French radio commentator suggested that if Britain wanted compensation for the lorry drivers' strike, then France should send a bill for the damage. David Cass was at the match.
The French FA tried and almost succeeded to create a total segregation of English camp followers. Significantly, the bulk of the chair throwing, begun by French hooligans, and the fighting, which involved both sets, was in an area to which English youths had gained an unwelcome access. As running fights continued during the match, a party of schoolchildren was evacuated. With most of the children removed, that small area was ready for the entry of the CRS riot police. Their strong-arm tactics for once welcomed by Parisians, as they dished out their own distinctive style of justice. On their return, some of England's legitimate supporters blamed French hooligans more than the English.
French supporters were really out of order. They ripped all the seats out, they threw them at the English supporters, and English supporters fought back, didn't they? Yeah. That's about what started it. There was no backup from the police. The police never stopped any fighting throughout the whole game. They let them all fight, they let people get beaten up badly, and then, after that, they weighed him in the battens and they indiscriminately battered anybody. Fair, isn't it?
The FA party returned with a grim warning of possible reprisals.
Well, there could be a total ban on English fans and English football. I mean, it's a ridiculous situation, isn't it?
The sports minister has appealed again to European governments to do more than merely expel the offenders.
Yes, I have asked other European ministers in Rotterdam, not just the French. I asked all the European ministers to consider last year, when I initiated the paper in January of 1983, that it was no good simply bunging them out on the next ferry, or the next plane, or the next train, or whatever, and that this has happened for far too long in recent years, and that many of them have got away with it.
The French are now cleaning up the evidence, but as if to answer Neil McFarlane's call for more and harder treatment in the courts, they also announced that only 6 youths have been charged following the violence. That will not be enough to satisfy either our government or football authorities.
The government is lending British Aerospace £250 million to develop the new European Airbus, the A320. British Aerospace had wanted to borrow almost twice that amount. Now they say they'll try to raise the rest of the money themselves. It should mean thousands of new jobs in British Aerospace, mainly in Chester, where the wings are assembled. But there'll be more work at other British Aerospace factories too, and possibly 2,000 more jobs elsewhere in the aircraft industry.
At present, the A320 only exists in model form. It won't come into airline service until 1988. But Airbus Industries say there's a world market for 2,000 airliners of this size by the end of the century, and they think the European consortium will win at least a third of those orders. That's why British Aerospace, who build the wings for existing Airbuses, were so anxious to take a quarter share in the new project. The problem was money. They needed more than £600 million, but told the government they could only find a third of that. They asked Whitehall to lend the other £400 million. In the event, they settled for £250 million, and the British taxpayer now has a stake in the plane. So does that mean the government will try to persuade British Airways to place an order?
I think the best thing is for the A320 to persuade British Airways that it's the aeroplane that they should buy. In other words, we want British Airways to have the best aircraft for its route structure. I hope that that will be the A320.
There's one cloud on the horizon, however. Boeing's rival product, the 737-300, is already flying and is available now. British Aerospace are hoping airlines will delay their orders until the A320 is available. In the meantime, today's decision guarantees almost 7,000 British jobs for the next 20 years.
The government got another gloomy set of unemployment figures today, even though the actual number of people without work went down. There were just over 3,186,000 people claiming unemployment benefit last month, a drop of 13,000. But the total should go down more at this time of year, and the seasonally adjusted figure shows a rising trend. It's the second consecutive jump of almost 29,000, putting the underlying total above 3 million for the first